I started out for Nashville with a yellow Cadillac and a yellow-haired woman. It was a big step for me, a chance I was taking, and I was anxious to get started. I'd thought long and hard about leaving Phoenix, even asking another RCA artist passing through town what he thought about me moving. His name was Willie Nelson, and he had been having success as a songwriter. Crazy and funny how time slips away for Patsy Cline were already standards, and Fair and Young's Hello Walls was well on its way of becoming a classic. He was a fellow Texan appearing across town at the Riverside Ballroom. We had never met before, but my first album was about to come out, and he had just gotten his start recording as an artist in his own right. Now, he liked my singing, and I liked his. Willie came to town and sent word that he'd like to meet me. I went over to the Adams Hotel. I spent the afternoon finding out how much we had in common, asking him about Nashville and what I might expect. He had just moved there himself. I told him I had a good deal at J.D.'s. By then, I was making maybe $1,500 a week clear. Not bad for a sit-down job, as we called gigs that we didn't have to go on the road for. Don't move, he told me, and if you do, let me have the job. As usual, I followed the opposite course. I'd been in Nashville a couple of times during the previous year, 1965, looking around, cutting songs with Chet, and generally getting the feel of the city. I'd been there once before Bobby saw me, and tried to see if I couldn't get something going, and all I found was doors closed. I didn't know anybody then, and nobody knew me. 8 months later, Chet's blessing had made all the difference. I was the talk of the town. When I arrived, it was at Nashville's invitation, and along the grapevine, the word was out. Sometimes you don't need a hit record. If you go somewhere and sit down and make enough noise, they'll know it's you that they want, and they came to me. Bobby Bear put me up when I officially came to town to record for RCA as an artist. I spent 3 days in mid-March. And for the record, it was the 16th, 18th, and 19th, cutting most of what would become my first album, Folk Country. In those sessions, we recorded 12 songs, including my first single, That's a Chance I'll Have to Take, as well as a couple of B-sides. My first single came out in May, and Chet called me back to Nashville on July 28th to cut a few more songs for the album. Among the newer things that I did was Anita, You're Dreaming. The time I came back for the third time in the middle of February 1966, cutting a variety of material that ranged from That's What You Get for Loving Me to the Beatles' Norwegian Wood, Stop the World and Let Me Off had gotten into the top 15, and Anita was riding midway in the country charts. Folk Country was coming out the next month. Chet had declared March Male Singer Month at RCA, and the company was riding high with 10 entries in the top 25, including, along with me, Porter Wagner, Eddie Arnold, Hank Locklin, Jim Reeves, Archie Campbell, and Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler with Ballad of the Green Berets. I still needed a place to live and a way to feed the band. Now, the second priority was probably more urgent, because we almost starved when we first came to Nashville. Until my record started selling, I was not going to be a big money man. Even then, a hit country album could only be counted on for selling about 20,000 to 30,000 copies. W.E. Lucky Moeller, a booking agent, had promised to keep me working, which in Lucky's terms meant I wouldn't be home very much. Lucky sold volume. His principle was to keep the Billies on the road. He might play 3 or 4 times a year at the Flame in Minneapolis or the Horseshoe in Toronto, crisscrossing the country with hardly any rhyme or reason. To keep the band busy, he would discount them to a lower price. I'd be on the road all the time, generating Lucky's 10% by the week and 15% for one-nighters. And it would get me a lot of public exposure. Before I'd left Phoenix, I talked with John Cash about sharing an apartment when I got to Nashville. I met John through June Carter, who had crossed my path years before when I was still a disc jockey in Lubbock. But the closer I got to calling him up when I arrived, the worse the idea seemed. I was hanging out with Barbara, and even though I'd gotten to know John a little bit, there was still something of a starstruck teenager in me who had heard Cry, Cry, Cry over the radio. Beyond what we saw in each other's performers, we had a mutual respect centered around songs that we knew as kids. Our backgrounds were so similar, sharing poor cotton fields and a love for music all the way back as far as we could remember. You ever hear this one was the way our conversations usually started. And it didn't stop until we challenged each other all the way back to Vernon Del Hart and Carson Robinson in the 20s. We shared the music more than anything else. Later, I went to see him in Albuquerque with Tex Ritter opening. Now, John told me that he was thinking about moving to Nashville. He was having some trouble at home trying to get June to marry him, and he needed a place to flop down, or what we'd call crash. "Why don't we get an apartment together?" he asked. It was just a regular one-bedroom on the first floor of the Fontaine Royal Apartments in Madison, right off Gallatin Road. Barbara moved down the hall about 4 or 5 doors away, which made it really convenient. We were trying to keep our relationship a secret until I got a divorce. Lynn wasn't making it too easy. Me and John were the world's champions at taking pills, and we didn't let on to the other that we knew. We never shared drugs. I can laugh about it now and say, hell, I knew he couldn't handle it, and he couldn't. I guess he felt the same way about me. I had a problem, and he had a problem, but we never made it a mutual problem. I'd started popping pills back in Salt Lake City. When you're young, you're bulletproof, and I thought nothing of staying up all night and singing and trying to write songs. John and I could never do that together. 2 guys on amphetamines. We were just too scattered. We worked at cross purposes, trying to find a common axis. Strung out, lying to each other about what we were doing. It's a wonder we got along as well as we did. Now, I never liked downers. I was hyper as hell and was taking uppers on top of that. I never hit the ground for 21 years. I had incredible stamina. I prided myself in the fact that I could take more pills, stay up longer, sing more songs, screw more women than most anybody you ever met in your life. Now, I didn't know when to stop, and I didn't see any need to. I didn't know until later that they were addictive. I thought they were medicine. Playing 6 nights a week in Phoenix, I'd use the pills as an energy boost. You'd be tired, but you didn't know it. Later, when I got on the road, we'd have to drive 800 and 900 miles to the next show, and the next one after that, arriving just in time to put my clothes on and hit the stage. They seemed the only solution to get where you were going, and I was just trying to make it through the night, the day, and the following week. Almost everybody in Nashville took pills. When Roger Miller and I got to be close, it seemed like washing down a handful of pills was a natural part of life. He was the cleverest, craziest man I ever met. He never quit being funny. He could think faster than anyone and forget it quicker. I'd say a cliche and he'd write a whole song around it. If I'd ask him to repeat it, he'd just shake his head and shrug and say, damned if I know what I just sang. He had briefcases full of pills, and we had as many names for them as they had colors. Roger took these things called Simcoes, so we called him Roger Simcoe. And they were what was known as over and under. One side was a tranquilizer, and the other side would be an amphetamine, and they also had vitamins in them. There were Johnny Whitecrosses and Waylon's Phoenix Flashes, speckled birds and little bitty desoxins, Desbital pancakes. Somebody would want to trade a couple of footballs for some red M&Ms. Pills were the artificial energy on which Nashville ran around the clock and then some. They were the drug of choice, and for a while it seemed like 80% of the people in town were comparing notes on who was taking which ones and what they were doing to them. Pill talk. In a way, they were the great leveler. You got any pills? That was a chain that drew Nashville's elite and aspiring together, the haves and the have-nots. And after the bars closed, we'd congregate at Sue Brewer's to share uppers and downers and guitars and songs. She called the place the Boar's Nest. It wasn't a club, but it was her apartment. And the best music to come out of Nashville was written right on her floor. Sue worked in a place called the Derby Club until 3 in the morning, and then she'd come home, set out the welcome sign. She had stocked the refrigerator, and every once in a while some of us would give her some money for beer and food. We'd sit on the couch and deal poker or talk about new things that we were working on, and maybe finish the song. Struggling songwriters would stop by like Chris Christopherson and Dallas Frazier. And though it was the unwritten law that you couldn't bug anybody, if you had a good song, you could sing it for Farron Young, George Jones, Mac Vickery, or Merle Kilgore. It was like a jungle telegraph. If I came in early in the morning and sang a song, somebody might be talking about it in the afternoon to so-and-so, and maybe they would give it a listen. A lot of good songs got pitched that way. The boar's nest was open well into the daylight, and sometimes, if she was taken with him, it could become a bed and breakfast. Finally, Sue would grab 3 or 4 hours sleep and get little Mikey off to school and head back to work. I was married to Barbara by now. After I got my formal divorce from Lynn, it was either get hitched or go our separate ways. Now, I wasn't ready for that. I loved her, and she loved me too. We thought marriage was a missing ingredient, and we added it to our already spicy relationship on October 22nd, 1967. She didn't stand a chance. Barbara was a good woman, but she got me at a point where I didn't trust women. She deserved a better shot than she got. We fought like cats and dogs. My drug use didn't help, and she didn't use drugs. None of my wives did. I'd be up all night roaming around, and she'd get disgusted and storm home. Then she'd get all torn apart, not knowing what I was doing and suspecting what I was up to. She didn't want to be in the hotels, and she couldn't take me on stage with all the girls around. Everywhere we went, there was a town full of females. That just drove her up a tree. She wanted me to settle down and be a husband. She never understood what made me keep going after the sound I heard in my head, and why I wanted to perform so bad, which meant she never really understood me. The first place I landed when I got to town was Harlan Howard's Wilderness Music. Now, the nights were when the wild ones hung out and roared. The daytime trips took care of most of the Music Row's business. I'd carry my guitar over to visit music publishers like Tree, where Roger Miller was based, and go from there to Acuff Rose or Cedarwood or Central. You'd play each other's songs and sit in on each other's recording sessions. Session hopping is what we called it. Don Bowman was West Coast starvation buddies with Harlan, and so was Bobby Bear. Harlan was everybody's friend. His childhood hero was Ernest Tubb, and he hadn't grown much since then. In fact, he thought if you're really into country songs, Ernest probably had more influence than Hank Williams. Depending on how close you lived to Texas, he just may have been right. He'd become Nashville's leading songwriter in the 60s and had a catalog of Harlan songs a mile long. Heartaches by the Number, I Fall to Pieces, Busted. I recorded over 70 of his songs myself and even did a whole album called Waylon Sings Old Harlan. Harlan used to write without a guitar, just holding a legal pad. More than most, the strength of country music is its lyrics. Now, I'd fill up pages and pages of legal pads. I'd write about every notion that came to mind. When I ran out of paper, I'd scribble on anything I could find, napkins, matchbooks, dollar bills, if I had a dollar. Now, I didn't worry about how to sing the songs. Melodies form a marriage with words. They tell you where they want to go, and you can always change them. Harlan's first hit was Pick Me Up on Your Way Down. Now, when he sang it for you, his voice would rise on the first 3 words and fall on the last 4, and it wouldn't make sense otherwise. Your melody goes where the words take you. I depend on a lyric to give me the melody, and a good lyric will pull the melody out of you. You never knew who you'd see when you walked in the office in the 800 block of 17th Avenue. Roger, Willie, or Mel Tillis, back when he was just getting started as a singer, they could be standing around. Hank Cochran, Conway Twitty, Lefty Frizzell, and even Tex Ritter. Sometimes we'd have unplanned parties. It was like Grand Central Station. You could reach up and touch the stars in Nashville then, or at least get ribbed by them. Tex Ritter used to call me Piss Ain't, of all things. Though some were a little aloof, most of the big names would make you feel welcome, like Carl Smith and Fair and Young. They kind of laughed at the star thing, and I liked that. We were swarming everywhere. Sleep was just a waste of time. It was so exciting, all that stuff happening around you, that you were afraid to take a nap, scared you'd miss something. Napoleon only slept 3 hours a night. Now, that was my big excuse for staying up. Cops would never bother you. They knew that you were taking pills and getting high. Bet they'd come by and just wave and say hi, because we didn't hurt nobody. The only people that we were really screwing up were ourselves, and we didn't seem to care. They didn't mess with us at all. Music Row was a neighborhood of houses along tree-lined streets that made them seem more friendly. You didn't have to have an appointment. You could stop by and see Owen Bradley and Chet Atkins and ask if they were busy. You were welcome everywhere, if you were welcome anywhere. Though if they wanted to ignore you, they sure could. I had brought my band, the Wailers, with me. I needed a band for road work, and they were my friends. In Tommy's case, he was my brother. He was playing bass for me, but side men were not welcome on Music Row. We were in some big shot's office one time, and whenever Jerry or Richie would make a comment or ask a question, the guy behind the desk would look at me and answer it. After a couple of rounds of this, I could see the hurt in the band's eyes. The next day, I was going back to the same office. "Come on, guys, let's go," I said. "Nah," they answered, "we're going to hang around the hotel." Well, they'd been with me through thick and thin, and I tried to let the powers that be know how I felt. "We've been hungry together," I told them. "My band is here for the long run." "Well, you don't bring your own cliques to Nashville," they told me. "You don't bring sidemen down on Music Row." I took it all in. "Those guys are with me," I said. "They've been everywhere with me. And if they can't be there, then I won't be there. If they're not welcome, I'm not welcome either," and I walked out. It was the same closed society at sessions. They didn't understand the concept of a band. They let me use Richie, or they'd let me use Jerry Gropp. Then they treated them like aliens. It was either you play the road, or you play sessions. Now, they actually got mad when I wanted to use my band on my recordings. "Well, road musicians can't play in the studios," they said. I'd say, "Why not?" And they'd say, "They're just not smooth enough." And I'd say, "Yippee." I always wanted a live sound in the studio, and now we're getting somewhere. I like things that weren't perfect. It was okay for microphones to leak into each other like on a stage performance, and I wanted to hear Richie's foot drum loud and clear. I wanted to feel some excitement. I could never play with a band that moves on the beat or under the beat. I couldn't get into it. It had to be on the edge. My music is built on the edge. That's the rock and roll in me, I guess. When I'd hear it on the beat, it felt like it was dragging. I needed it to push. Now, the Wailers may not have been the greatest musicians in the world, but neither was I. And neither was that slick shit I was hearing. It about wore me out. I couldn't even find a place to come in. I had to figure Chet Atkins out. When I first got there, whether we worked together or just sat around and talked, he was real quiet. It didn't take me too long to understand how he responded to things, to read him, to see what reaction I could get out of him and know when I had him. For Chet, a smile meant, "That sounds pretty good." And a grin was wonderful out of him in the studio. If he said, "Man, I like that," well, it was probably going to be a #1 record. I often fantasized what it would be like to be out in the studio recording with Chet. And he'd get up in the control room, stand on top of the console, jump through a plate glass window, rise up, wipe all the blood off, and yell, "God damn, that's a smash." Then I'd like to say, "Could I try it just once more?" Chet wanted me to be myself, but he wanted me to be myself with musicians he knew were great and he'd been relying on. Chet had his comfort zone. A drummer that never wavered, a piano player that tickled down the same ivories, a smooth backing vocal from the Jordanaires or the Browns or the Anita Kerr singers. If the truth be told, Chet and I respected each other's intelligence. I always had ideas, and he liked watching me make them happen. He wanted to see where I was going. Now, I didn't know how much room he gave me until he used me on some sessions playing 12-string guitar. I watched these other artists who would bring nothing to the table. They just went in there, and Chet had to do all the work, arranging and everything. They were just standing around waiting for a chance to sing. Gradually, though, I think I made Chet nervous. It was drugs more than anything. He did not understand drugs, and he didn't understand people on them. Chet didn't want to understand. He'd been through Don Gibson and Roger Miller, and here I come. Chet come from East Tennessee, where they drank moonshine all the time. Now, when he thought high, he thought whiskey. I'm sure he never took a pill in his life. "I think you got just so many beats in your heart," he'd say, "so why shorten them?" Dropping by to see Chet was like sticking my head in the jaws of a lion. I do have to give him credit, though, for patience. He could have said, "I'm not going to mess with you. You're out of here. Anytime." But he stayed with me because he knew how to let things take their natural course and when to let me find my own way. Chet cut the best records of my early years. He may have told me once or twice to straighten up and look with disapproval on my drug use, But like Don Gibson, I think he thought I was a good renegade. If anything, Chet was too nice. He would internalize so much that he grew a tumor and suffered cancer of the intestines. Now, the business literally made him sick. The stress was really too much. I couldn't have helped trying to communicate ideas that I was still trying to explain to myself. There just wasn't enough happening musically for me, and I'd be right on the edge of things, and the way the music unfolded didn't seem to be pushing it over the top. They were good, smooth records, and there I was, rougher than a goddamn cob. He'd let me use some of my band, and then he'd put other people in there. And sometimes those things that he put in there were just enough to keep it from what it was really supposed to sound like in my imagination. Now, if I wrote those songs and honed them on stage with my band, I had an idea of what they should be, and they weren't. Barbara and I had started to split up. I think Barbara was just as loyal and true to me as she could be, and though she never believed it, knowing all of those women were out there on the road, not knowing what I was doing, suspecting me of the worst crimes, I tried to be good to her. Because we had had such misery through Lynn, I felt that I owed her a straight chance. But it was just a constant battle. We'd fight on the phone, we'd fight on and off the road. All of my ex-wives hated what I did. And they were so jealous of the music. It was like the music was another woman. They kept hoping that I'd give it up for them, and they were right to be concerned. I wasn't about to stop playing the guitar and singing to keep my home life together. I remember Dwayne Eddy talking to Lynn, telling her that she had to grow with me in order for it to ever work. And she had flat out told him that she did not want me to be a star. Lynn, or Maxine, and now Barbara, knew the music, the real other woman, was taking me away, and it had to hurt. Sometimes, especially in a relationship with someone you love, you bring out different qualities, and I brought out a meanness in Barbara that really shouldn't have been there. After a time, I knew that it wasn't going to ever work anymore. I'd never be back. I took her home for the last time. Then I went wild. I was everywhere, all in a day that became a night that became day again. I would never just go in a room. I walked all over it. Curtis Buck was a crazy son of a bitch, and he ran around with me. While I was singing, he'd go out and find the girls, and if we needed drugs, well, he'd find the dope. The music, the pills, and the women. Now, that was our life on the road. Sometimes I'd be with 2 or 3 a night. Richie remembers me reserving extra rooms in hotels and running up and down emergency staircases to get from one room to the other. Once in Louisville, I had girls stashed on 3 different floors. I had been awake for a few days, and I was determined to visit them all. Waylon, he said to me, "You're going to kill yourself." I took pills by the fistful. I'd start with a Desoxyn or 2 and some little White Crosses. Then I'd wash the whole mess down with an Alka-Seltzer that would kick it in the butt. It'd come on like gangbusters. Then I'd drink coffee every once in a while, and I'd pop another one to keep going. A doctor once told me that if I took 1 Desoxyn a day for a month, I'd be a dead man. And I had to laugh. I knew that they might kill some people, but they didn't kill me. I thought I was invincible. 20 amphetamines a day was normal, and 30 wasn't unusual. I'd hit the ground running, and I never had a hangover because I never gave myself a chance to. If I would manage to go to sleep at night, I'd put a glass of water by the bed and about 3 pills right by the phone. When that wake-up call came, I'd take the pills, lay back until they kicked in, and then I was ready to go. Gotta go. One of the phrases that I always heard was, "I wish New York and L.A. would just leave us alone." The Nashville Sound never realized that they actually did leave us alone, to our detriment. If you were a country artist signed to Nashville, the record company treated you like an uninvited guest at a dinner party. They didn't even set a place at the table for you. They didn't take you seriously. Their corporate base was in New York or L.A., and we were out of the power structure. No matter how many records you sold, all their promotion went to the big pop acts signed to both coasts. You had to fight and scratch for any attention at all from the record company. Country music reacted to that by drawing the wagons. getting defensive, and building a wall around Nashville that kept country artists in rather than outsiders out. I went to Los Angeles and cut Chris Christopherson's Lovin' Her Was Easier with Ricky Nelson's band. At the time, he had a good bunch of guys with him, including Sonny Curtis. It was a great record, up-tempo with a good guitar riff. They wouldn't release it because it was recorded in L.A. They didn't want to set a precedent. They wanted all of the country hit records to be cut in Nashville. I never did feel at home. I didn't know it yet, but I was in trouble the minute I got there. I found myself trying to fit in and having people wedge me into places where I didn't work. I was being told over and over, you just don't do this and you can't do that. There's a certain way we do things in Nashville. We know what's best for you. All you're allowed to sound like is the Nashville sound. I would think of ideas, and before I got a chance to put them down, or even hear if they even worked, they'd tell me I was wrong. I'd say, what the fuck you mean it's wrong? Well, it'll make the record skip if we put that big drum beat on it. We don't understand that rhythm. We have to smooth it out, or we'll never get played on radio. And the best one was That's Not Country. I always hated labels, and they kept trying to stick one on me. They didn't know who I was or what I was about, and I tried my best to keep them in the dark. I remembered what Buddy had told me about not pinning yourself down. The very things that weren't country about me scared them, even though they tried to call me everything but straight country. They always needed a marketing plan. Folk country, Nashville rebel, outlaw. And they used it to understand me and try to put my feelings in a frame. And even then they didn't get it. Music is just music, and people who put labels on music are those who have to merchandise it. It makes their job a lot easier. I wanted to cut my records a whole different way. I wanted to build the song in the studio, not in the control room. I wanted the dynamics to happen out there with the band. I just did what felt good to me. It was like Grady Martin when they asked him if he could read music. Not enough to hurt my playing, he replied. The truth is, I never understood much about the mechanics of music. I'd come in wrong and turn the beat around. I was the only guy in the world who could hum out a meter. My guitar playing came from inspiration only. I did it out of self-preservation. I could never stand to practice. Everything I know, I learned in front of an audience. I went through my marriages like Grant went through Richmond. I finally gave up. I said, hell, I'm never going to be able to be married. And when I thought it was just about all over, when I quit looking, that's when I found the right one. I started with Jesse on a level ground. I was seeing Barbara before I left Lynn, and Lynn before I split with Maxine. Jesse Coulter, on the other hand, had just gotten unhitched from Dwayne Eddy, and we both were free. I guess it was her spunkiness that attracted me to her. She never let me off the hook, and she loved to pick at me and make me mad. She called it getting my temper up. Finally, I told her that she gave me more shit than anybody, and I didn't think I liked her very much. I like to see the fire, she said, pouring a little gasoline on the flames. We both knew right off that it was something that could be dangerous. And like a fire can warm you, she started drawing me in closer, bringing me out of the cold. She lit a fire under me all right and kept adding fuel, and pretty soon we began traveling together. Her mama was an ordained Pentecostal preacher, though she wasn't judgmental about our relationship. Jessie had been playing piano in the church and revival meetings since she was a little girl, and it gave her an inner strength, even though, when I met her, she thought she was in the cavern of her life, where she had thrown off all that she had known and gone seeking her own answers. Jessie had come back to the point to where she realized that she needed something more than she could ever know. And on that rock, she built her faith. For me, it was the music. For Marion, Rebecca, Joan, Johnson, Eddie, and soon to be Jesse Coulter, faith was expressed through the music. Together, we started learning the eternal melodies and infinite harmonies that has become our song of songs. On the road, we thought we were bulletproof. We loved the music, but the music was secondary to what we were doing. All we really did was party. We seemed to be in motion all the time. We'd be out there 300 days a year. We didn't work all the dates, but we couldn't afford to go back. We weren't making a whole lot of money. The only thing left to do was have a good time, and we were probably making terrible music, but as I look back, the edge was there, and the edge kept it alive. It may not have been good, but it was rocking. Richie and another member of the band named Jimmy were in a lot of trouble on June the 10th when they were arrested for marijuana possession at the Rainbow Bridge border, separating the U.S. and Canada. Heading back across the border to Nashville, our two-vehicle convoy, my Cadillac and a station wagon, got stopped at the Niagara Falls crossing. Long hairs in a limo. The Cadillac got through, but the station wagon was thoroughly searched. Jimmy Gray tried to toss out the evidence, but that alerted the cops. And pretty soon they found themselves in the slammer. Boy, were they mad at the cops and at each other, and I was laughing at them, calling them criminals. And then I really gave them a chewing out. I said, if you hadn't been messing with that shit, you wouldn't have gotten into trouble. If they'd have just been taking pills like me, they'd have been okay. I even fired Jimmy. Now, I was an easy boss, except when it came to dictating what kind of drugs you took. Of course, I never considered pills as being against the law. It was a lot like a little game with us, and we didn't know you could go to prison for pills. We weren't afraid of being busted because all we had to do was show your prescription bottle, or get somebody to write your prescription. The thing was, is I thought they were on drugs, and I was taking prescriptions. None of us realized that there was no difference. We'd gotten started on pills by getting them from doctors and pharmacists who gave us no warning. And booking agents would slip us pills to keep us going. Now that's no excuse, but we never even thought they were addictive. We didn't know that they could kill you, or make you kill yourself. I didn't like anybody to drink around me. I never touched the stuff. That was my big boast. And cocaine, I thought that was terrible, at least then. As for pot, I just didn't enjoy sitting around grinning. Richie and I wouldn't socialize much. He was with the band more. The drugs divided us, and as things got more out of control, Richie started thinking about taking a break. He was just running himself down living on amphetamines, and had been for 2 years or more. He needed to head home for a while and settle himself. He came to me on the bus and said, "Man, I'm worn out and I have to leave." I nodded and said, "Man, I wish I could go with you." Now, Jesse and I got married the next day after Richie left. I can't say one caused the other, but I was reaching out. Her hand took mine, and that's when I realized that I couldn't be complete without her. The Navajos call it the Long Walk. Forced into exile from their native land, marched to Fort Sumter in eastern New Mexico, where the government attempted to turn them into farmers and traders, contrary to their hunting and shepherding ways. They endured for 5 years of desolation before America admitted failure and sent them home to the wondrous place. I had come to the reservation, as I had many times before. The Indians liked me, and I felt at home among the Indians. Sometimes I think if it hadn't been for them, I might have had to do something else for a living. I could always draw a crowd there, and they were among my most loyal fans. The Indians had initially been won over by a love of the common people. In March of 1969, I'd been booked to play Flagstaff, Arizona by Johnny Yersick, a local boy. To promote the concert, he asked the area disc jockey, Mike McQuaid, of KGAK, to feature my current hit single, Mental Revenge, from the album that I had out at the time, called Jewels. It was a Mel Tillis song, but they didn't like it at the station, so they started spinning the B-side of The Chokin' Kind, which was nearly 2 years old at this point. They couldn't believe the reaction. Suddenly they were getting requests to play it before the record had a chance to fade out over the air. Even after McQuaid repeated it 6 times in a row, the phone would ring and a Native American voice would say on the other end, "Would you please let us hear Common People again?" They took to me like kin. They had a basic credo of trust and honor, and they lived their religion all day, every day, in the shadow of the Great Spirit. We both handled liquor about the same way, only in their case, they couldn't buy it just to drink. If cops caught them with alcohol, they'd take it away and put them in jail. So what they did was buy a whole bottle and swallow it all. They weren't buying a drink, they were buying a drunk. The same was true with me, only it was a pill intake that was covering over a sense of loss, of unfulfilled purpose. Even though it's hard to draw a comparison between the fate of a downtrodden, honorable people and one man's struggle to have his music heard, sometimes I felt that Nashville was fencing me in the same as these proud Indian tribes had been enclosed in their reservations. I'd lost my way. The more I worked, the more in debt I got. And the more my records sold, the further they receded from what I had in mind and the sound I wanted to hear, the impact I wanted them to have. I kept trying it their way, and I saw I wasn't going to get it. Nashville had a definite set formula as to what they thought a country record ought to sound like. There's more than one kind of country music, though, a wide range that takes in everything from bluegrass to western swing. Their country was smooth and pop. One road that led to Nashville south. Well, I couldn't do that. I didn't want to do that. In the summer of 1972, I had dates booked on the reservation north of Gallup. I'd gotten an antibiotic shot in town for a tooth problem, and Father Dunstan, the priest who booked us on the shows, told me that when I went up into the Indian settlements, I shouldn't eat or drink anything because there was an epidemic of hepatitis. I remembered his warning right after I'd eaten some pie and drank some milk in a little cafe near the Colorado border on the Ute Reservation. Now, when we got back to town, I felt sick and battered. We headed on to Buck Lake Ranch and played our show. After we finished, exhausted, I went back to the bus and laid down. I couldn't get up. My back was killing me and my kidneys hurt. Jesse came in and told me I was looking yellow. They took me home, and I didn't even wake up during the ride. The next thing I knew, there was a doctor looming over me. I was saying, bullshit, I ain't going to no hospital. He came and stood by the bed, looking 7 feet tall, and I said, God damn, Jesse, you done run a giant in on my ass. I didn't even know what hepatitis was, and I didn't want to quit. I was ready to keep going. Give me some pills, and I'll get right up from here again. I got to feeling worse, and Jessie was just like a little old chihuahua. She didn't know whether I was going to live or die, and she was nervous. Finally, she talked me into getting treatment at the hospital. It was the first time I'd pulled to a halt in years. Stop and start over. It's been the pattern of my life whenever things get beyond my control. Lying there, I started thinking about what I'd won after 10 years of banging around the honky-tonk circuit. My health was shot. I was close to $250,000 in debt and getting deeper in the hole whether I played shows or not. The IRS was on my tail, and I was paying alimony to 3 wives. If I went on the road, I lost money. If I stayed home, I lost more. As for record sales, I never got ahead of the 5% of 90%, and the packaging fees, and the overseas split, and the studio costs, and the multi-track accounting books. Whenever they gave you a piece of the royalties up here, they took it away down there. You couldn't figure who owed what and why. I wasn't getting ahead with a team of lawyers and accountants, and besides, we were supposed to be all shucks good old country boys. They thought we were stupid, that we were so thankful to be able to play the guitar and sing, so grateful that they gave us our start, and were happy that they were there when we needed them, as long as we didn't ask for any real power or look too closely behind the scenes. If you don't make waves, RCA, and Decca, Epic, and Capitol were telling us, we'll let you keep making records. Thanks, boss. I was tired of getting ripped off. Lucky Moeller was my manager as well as my booking agent, and I couldn't understand, even after being on the road more than 2/3 of the year, every year, how I could still owe him $30,000. Richie had come back in early 1972. One of the conditions of his return was that he could have his own stash, meaning pot. Now, I guessed that it worked for him. The first thing he had done after leaving was head back to Phoenix, buy a pound of grass, lock himself in a room for a month, sleeping and eating and getting off of pills. Having been away, he was a little bit shocked at the changes in me. He wasn't the only one. I was lying in bed getting more and more depressed over my prospects and wondering why I was sliding deeper into Nowheresville. I finally said to myself, I'm never going to have any hit records, and I'm never going to be a success in this business. I might as well go back to the nightclub circuit and play my music. It was all over. Wait a minute, he said, before you pack it in. I think that we can give it one more shot. Just try it. There's another way of doing things, and it's called rock and roll. Why not? It made a lot of sense. I was mentally rock and roll, and it was an attitude as much as music. We were rock and roll and everything but our allegiance to country. Even then, was a whole lot of rock in that. We were proud to be country, but that didn't mean that we had to be trapped in country music conventions or the way the artists were treated. Maybe if I stopped trying to fit in and started saying fuck it, it'd give me more of a chance to do things my way. If it didn't work, I'd be the only one to blame. I want you to meet Neil Reshin, Richie said. You're not going to like him at all. He's not like anything you're used to, and you're not going to trust him. But he's what you need now. I had asked RCA for an advance on royalties, $25,000, so I could get by while I was recuperating. At first, the New York office agreed, and then Jerry Bradley came to my house. He was Orrin Bradley's son. He had taken over most of Chet's executive duties at the record company. Richie had brought Neil around that day, and he was sitting quietly in the room when Jerry showed up. I was flat on my back, and he didn't know who Neil was, and I wasn't about to tell him. Jerry said to me, if you sign again for 5%, we'll let you have $5,000. The royalty was the same as I'd gotten as a newcomer. He went on about how bad he felt coming out there while I was sick and telling me that. And he even brought my record royalty statements to show me that this was all they could give me. Though they wanted to help me in any way they could, and really, they loved me and thought of me as part of the RCA family. I thanked him and told him that I'd think about it. After Jerry left, I sat down and we went over the statement with Neil. Reshin was about as un-Nashville as you could get. His company, Media Consulting, specialized in audits, and he had worked with Miles Davis and Frank Zappa. He was used to difficult clients. Neil ran his eyes over the figures. They're a bunch of hooves, was all he said. And he didn't need to add or subtract anymore. When Bradley came back, I told him that I wouldn't honor the new contract. Before I signed that, I'll quit, and I won't be recording anymore. Jerry later confided in me that he was never so glad when someone said no, that he felt like a snake trying to take advantage of me when I was so down. Driving back to the airport, Richie introduced Neil to Willie Nelson. Willie had retreated to Texas by that time, and like a lizard in his lair, he hardly ever came out of Austin. Neil's going to be Waylon's manager, Richie said. Well, let him manage me too, said Willie. Typical. There was a time when Neil fed me and Willie, and if it hadn't been for him, I don't know what we'd have done. He helped us a lot. He got things for us that no country singer had ever gotten before. If we were going to become outlaws, though we didn't know that yet, we needed an outlaw manager, as Willie called him. Now, Neil was perfect for the part. He was like a mad dog on a leash. When he got his teeth into something, he never let go. Now, he placed himself between us and the business as usual. And he wasn't about to be distracted by somebody throwing us a bone. We knew it wasn't going to be a forever thing. I told Willie, I said, someday we're going to have to run him off, but we can have a good ride. We never went to the trouble of working out a contract between us. Why bother? Neil was a genius at negotiation, and Willie and I had no chance of coming out ahead. He'd figure ways of beating people or making people beat themselves, and he'd get them ugly looks on his face. He must have practiced for hours on end, making faces in the mirror and practicing his responses. He could sit silent endlessly. It would just drive you crazy. The first one that spoke gave in. That was the way things were done. We were in Chet Atkins' office with all the executives from New York negotiating a new record deal. Frank Mancini was there and Joe Galante. New York could tell Nashville what to do, but Nashville couldn't tell New York a thing. The power of attorney only flowed one way. Neil wanted me to see how it was done. He was making these faces. I wanted to slap him myself, and he was on my side. But he knew what he was doing. If you peeve somebody to the point of anger, you jar them from their train of thought, and he wanted RCA off balance. It was down to a $25,000 sum, and they were not going to give it to me. Neil wanted it. So we were sitting there, not a word spoken, and the silence got unbearable. You could hear the clock tick in the room. Minutes passed. I got up, never said a word, and just walked out. I went to the bathroom to take a leak. When I came back, Neil greeted me in the hall. "You're a friggin' genius," he said. I said, "What?" "Walking out like that. That sewed it up." He was really happy. He said, "Where'd you go?" And I said, "I had to take a piss." And he said, "Well, that was a $25,000 piss." They asked me where you went, and I told them I didn't know. "Waylon's mad, I'm sure, and he's crazy. He's liable to do anything." "Well, will he be back?" they wanted to know. And I shrugged. "I guess he's gone, and we might as well call this meeting to a close." And that's when they gave us the money. It was probably the best time to apply pressure to RCA. There was something coming to the surface in my career. They saw that I was about to happen, and with or without their help. Willie had been given a career boost with his shift to Atlantic, and that was one of the labels that was bidding for me. RCA didn't know when or how, but they knew they would regret losing me. It didn't help that they got caught with their britches down. They were stealing me blind. One day I got the idea to find out what they were paying the songwriter, as far as mechanical royalties were concerned. Now, if I'd been the only one to record that song, and I found out what the publisher received, I could compare it with my own sales statement. Red Lane was the sole writer on Walk On Out of My Mind, and I was the only artist that had recorded it. From experience, I knew that Tree Music, his publisher, would not stand for getting shortchanged. So I called him to find out how much money in mechanicals that he had made on the record. I discovered that they'd only paid me half of what they owed me, holding the rest in reserve for returns. The reserve amounted to about $150,000 once you got through inspecting their books. When the smoke had cleared, I'd gotten a new recording contract that I could live with. My percentage was up close to 8%. I also received $70,000 up front. When they handed me the check, they asked me what I was planning to do with the money. "I'm going to start my own label," I answered. "If you think I'm going to put up with you guys, you're crazier than hell." "I told you he was crazy," said Frank Mancini. The best part was getting my own production company, which meant I could record my own records and then hand in the completed masters to RCA. WGJ Productions. It had a nice ring. Waylon Goddamn Jennings Productions. Free at last. I finally had control over my music, how it was going to be advertised, promoted, sweetened, or in my case, soured and mixed. Chet always worried that I was out to destroy something. He thought that I was determined to ruin country music, that there would be no reason for people like himself and Owen Bradley to produce records. Now, that was never my intention. There are always people who need ideas, but I'm not someone who can be told what to do musically. Now, if you stop and think about it, it was not that I'm such a genius. It might have been that I'm just not smart enough to follow instructions. I have to do what I feel. What I was fighting for was the right to try things my way, at least one time. I felt I had that right. Win or lose, I was now able to use my band, choose my own songs, and turn up the bass drum. In theory, that is. Though I had agreed to record in their studios with their engineers, soon enough I found out that that was not going to work. They were on the phone half the time, calling Jerry Bradley upstairs at RCA and telling him what I was doing. I was still screwed. This time was a song that I had written 4 years previously. RCA had said that it wasn't any good, but with my newfound freedom, it became the centerpiece of one of my first albums under the WGJ logo. Recorded in October of 1973, Willie played guitar on it and helped me put it together, along with a couple of his songs, Heaven and Hell, and one of my personal favorites, It's Not Supposed to Be That Way. As we worked, it became apparent that I was destined to go through the same runarounds every time I stepped outside of Nashville's musical city limits. Finally, I'd had enough, and I moved the sessions to Tom Paul Glazer's Hillbilly Central Studios at 916 19th Avenue South. RCA protested mightily, but I told them that this is the way it was going to be from now on. This time went to number 1 in June 1974. It was my first chart-topping smash. Tom Paul and I were best friends. We'd met about the time he broke up with his brothers, and I kind of took their place in his life. He had been in town a lot longer than I had, and I think I was a little in awe of him, really. I loved his singing so much, but when he started airing his opinion, and he did have an opinion on about everything, you couldn't shut him up. One of my favorite Glazier Brothers songs was called Words Come Easy. In Tom Paul's case, it couldn't have been more accurate. He'd rather argue than care whether he was right or wrong. Tom Paul will argue with God when he gets there, or the devil, whichever one grabs him first. We had a good time tearing up Nashville, and there'll always be a place in my heart for Tom Paul. We're on a motorcycle, me and Willie, riding past 5 miles of backed up traffic. People hollering, car doors opening in front of us, flags waving, girls leaning off of pickup trucks and frisbees flying. A different song from each radio as we zip along the shoulder. We're covered with caliche dirt and shouting ourselves hoarse, heading for the Dripping Springs reunion, Independence Day, 1973.